الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh Al-Maram by Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani alayhi rahmatullah ta'ala, and we're covering matters pertaining to the hadith that he had mentioned regarding ahkam al-hayd wal-nifas wal-istihadha. So the author, he opened with the hadith of Aisha, and we have covered matters pertaining to that particular, the ahkam that relates to that particular hadith. And today, inshallah ta'ala, we'll go to the second hadith, with the hadith of Asma bint Umais, and what have been mentioned regarding this hadith and the different discussion related to this particular topic. So the hadith will be read, and then we'll go through discussing the hadith bi'awnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Chapter 10, the bab of menstruation. Under the hadith number 118 as well. And in the hadith of Asma bint Umais, reported by Abu Dawud, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, she should sit in a tub, and when she sees a yellowish color on the surface of the water, she should take a bath once for the Dhuhr and Asr prayers, and take another bath for the Maghrib and Isha prayers, and take a bath once for the Fajr prayer. And in between these times, she should perform ablution.
So the author here I mentioned regarding the discussion in the bab of hayd, where he states of this hadith, في hadith Asma bint Umais عند أبي داود لا تجلس في مرك فإذا رأت صفرة فوق الماء فليغتسل للظهر والعصر غسلا واحد ولتغتسل للمغرب والعشاء غسلا واحد وتغتسل للفجر غسلا وتوضأ فيما بين ذلك. So this is the hadith that I mentioned here that have been read regarding of the discussion regarding to that relates to hayd, that this hadith is mentioned as a part of this discussion. So as we'll normally discuss, we'll discuss concerning the Sahabiya who have narrated this hadith. So the author mentioned in the Abu Dawud. So normally that Ibn Hajar, he will mention those who have collected the hadith at the end of the hadith. But in this case, he somewhat brought it forward, which is Abu Dawud. So Abu Dawud is the one who have collected this particular hadith, that normally it will mention those collectors at the end of the hadith. But in this case, he mentioned at the beginning of the hadith, he mentioned fil hadith Asma bint Umais in the Abu Dawud. So the first of those things to discuss is Asma bint Umais. So as the first time that she had been mentioned, so we'll kind of somewhat mention something regarding the Sahabiya that we should regard the Sahabiya. So it is mentioned by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan in his explanation when he discussed concerning this particular Sahabiya, that he state regarding her, that one regarding her name. So as for her name, Asma bint Umais. So Asma bint Umais. They mention that he mentioned في نسبها, in her lineage, there's some form of khilaf regarding her lineage, but her name, which is known Asma bint Umais. And it mentioned that she's of the early ones to have accepted Islam. So of the early ones to have accepted Islam, and also she made the hijrah to Habasha. So the early ones amongst the early group to accept Islam that were from the people of Mecca. Then at certain point they made hijrah to Habasha, and she was amongst those people who made al-hijrah. And she made hijrah, as it mentioned, that with her zawj, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. So she at that time was married to Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, anhu, and they gave between both of them in their union, in their marriage, that they had 3 children. So they had 3 children, and also she made hijrah also to Medina. So hijrah to Habasha. Then upon return they made hijrah. She went and made hijrah to Al-Medina, and mentioned regarding concerning, so that's concerning the matter, and that it states regarding that of those that she was tushid, that she was killed in or her husband was killed. Her husband was killed with Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. So he died in the battle of, and after his death, in the battle I mentioned that when he died, in the battle of Mut'ah, he died in the Yawm al-Mut'ah, Then after his death, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, then she married Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. She married Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And also between them, they had children. So between them, that they have a child, Muhammad, who they mentioned that she gave birth to Muhammad, as he mentioned, Waqt Ihram fi Hajjat al-Wada. So during Hajj, that she gave birth to her child, Muhammad, with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Then also they mentioned that after the death of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, anhu, that she, his wife, who's Asma, that she was involved in the washing of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. So his wife, Asma bint Umais, that she washed her husband then, who's Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, upon his death. And so it shows that I mentioned, then after the death of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, then she married Ali ibn Abi Talib. She married Ali ibn Abi Talib. So mentioned that she married Ja'far. Upon his death, she married Abu Bakr. Then after the death of Abu Bakr, she married Ali ibn Abi Talib. So that's concerning of so of those who they mentioned here regarding concerning, that's something brief regarding this Sahabiya who's Asma bint Umais. So they mentioned regarding concerning a second matter that we'll discuss, that will mention the second matter or the thing to be discussed next is takhrij of the hadith wa hukum al hadith. So takhrij of the hadith and also hukum upon the hadith, where they mentioned that the hadith as stated by Ibn Hajar, as he stated in the Abu Dawud, that the hadith is collected by Abu Dawud in his As-Sunan. So as for those who have done some work on the book of Bulugh Al-Maram, by way of doing the editing of the book and the print of the book, that there are many, but of those that they have mentioned, of those, we have Sheikh Mahir Al-Fahl. So Sheikh Mahir Al-Fahl, that in his checking of the editing of the book of Bulugh Al-Maram, as for Takhrij, he mentioned Akhrajahu Abu Dawud. So the hadith is found in Abu Dawud, Tahawi fi Shar al-Mushkil, Darussalam, Hakim wal-Bayhaqi. So he mentioned as the source of this hadith, the books of hadith, the reference sources for this hadith, Abu Dawud, At-Tahawi in his book Shar al-Mushkil, Darussalam, Al-Hakim wal-Bayhaqi. Then he has some discussion regarding this particular hadith. So he has some discussion regarding this particular hadith. So you find that also, before going to that discussion, that is stated that so the hadith is in those sources of the hadith can be referred back to those particular sources and others. So Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, when he referenced hadith by way of Taqrib, he mentioned hadith is in the Abu Dawud, also the hadith in the Darussalam, Al-Hakim, Bayhaqi. Yani with the same isnad that go back, they mention min isnad that have min tariq Suhail ibn Abi Saleh, min tariq Suhail ibn Abi Saleh, and Zuhri, and Awra ibn Zubair, and Asma ibn Umais al-Hadith. Then and also bear in mind that this particular hadith that Ibn Hajar only mentioned a portion of the hadith. So the hadith also have additional wordings. There's additional statement in the hadith, but he mentioned just a portion of the hadith, not the entire hadith. So overall concern that I mentioned that regarding this hadith, so those are the sources that I mentioned the hadith. Then a discussion between the ulama regarding the authenticity of the hadith. So a discussion regarding the authenticity of this particular hadith, where you find that of the ulama who take the hadith to be daif, and of the ulama who had it to be Maqbul Hasan. So a discussion between the ulama regarding this particular hadith. So as for what is mentioned by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, he mentioned the hadith as stated here, that so the hadith of a longer version, it mentioned that an Asma bint Umais ta'ala anha قالت قلت يا رسول الله إن الفاطمة بنت أبي حبيش استحضت منذ كذا وكذا فلم تصلي فقال رسول الله الإسلام سبحان الله هذا من الشيطان لا يجلس في مركن الحديث, to the end of the hadith. So they mention regarding concerning this particular hadith, so that's the full wording of the hadith, that it is stated that even Abu Dawud, so first concerning Imam Abu Dawud, when he mentioned this particular hadith that have been cited, that Abu Dawud, that he said regarding this hadith, where when the hadith was mentioned, that Abu Dawud, this particular hadith, where the end of the hadith mentioned, that's mentioned that the hadith mentioned, فيجلس في مركن فإذا رأت صفرة فوق الماء فليغتسل. للظهر والعصر غسل واحد ولتغتسل للمغرب والعشاء غسل واحد وتغتسل للفجر غسلا توضأ فيما بين ذلك. So you find in Abu Dawud they have the word at the end they mention what tawadda, and the one of in Bulugh Al-Maram that it have tatawadda, so it have tatawadda, so it have tuta. In Abu Dawud, the print of Abu Dawud, of the print of Sheikh Shuaib al-Dawood, it has one with tawadda, it has tawaddana tatawadda. So that's something. Then he mentioned that, then he mentioned the hadith. Then he mentioned رجال, then he mentioned that الشويب al-Dawood, that he mentioned رجاله ثقات إلا أنه اختلف فيه على سهيل ابن أبي صالح كما فصلناه فيما سبق الرقم ثلاثة الرقم such and such. So you have somewhat discussed this hadith before regarding this particular narrator, where Abu Dawud, when he stated the hadith, he mentioned قال أبو داود رواه مجاهد عن ابن عباس لما اشتد عليها الغسل أمرها أن تجمع بين صلاتين. So Ibn Abu Dawud, he also added, commented by stating that رواه مجاهد and Ibn Abbas, that Ibn Abbas is stated that فلما اشتد, that when it become very severe upon her al-ghusl, then she was commanded that she should combine between between the two salat. So that's concerning, so indicating that it became very intense upon her regarding al-ghusl, so it was told she just to combine between both the two salat. So as for also what is stated regarding takhrij of the hadith, as we mentioned, some of the ulama or the hadith to be daif. So they have mentioned regarding concern that, that of the ulama who all mentioned that Suhail ibn Abi Saleh wahm, that he made an error, that an error occurred by way of Suhail. I've made an error in the matan and in the sanad. So this narrator, Suhail ibn Abi Saleh, he made an error in the matan, the text of the hadith, the wording of the hadith, and also in the sanad, and also in the chain of hadith. So they mentioned that as for in case of those error mentioned concerning that who's the lady that's supposed that is mentioned, in some mention Asma bint Umais, according to his narration. Some mention the khabar of Fatima. So you find that a difference as to who the reference of this hadith is discussing, who the one that was mentioned the hadith. So they mentioned ittirab, is somewhat as some confusion regarding this particular narration, or errors regarding this particular narration. And also they mentioned that qad rawahu, also of those who have narrated this hadith, which is more, of course, so we're discussing more hadithiyah. So some may be a bit lost, but be patient with us, bi'awnillahi subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we can understand of some of the ulama look of hadith and critique hadith, that we understand is a process, and what we're mentioning is something, what we're mentioning here is still somewhat summarized. So they have mentioned that regarding the isnad of this particular hadith, that you find that az-Zuhri, that you find many have narrated from Zuhri. Mentioned that Zuhri, one of the narrators of the hadith, so from Zuhri you have many students narrated from him. So that mentioned that amongst them that over that of those who have narrated on Zuhri, that you have 9 others who have narrated upon Zuhri. So you have 9 others narrators who have narrated this hadith upon az-Zuhri. So then they mentioned that of this narration, you find that of those other who have narrated upon, say, Suhail narrated upon Zuhri, but also you have others. You have 9 others who have narrated this hadith upon az-Zuhri. Amongst them who are said to be mukthirin, of those who are said to be the ones who have narrated a lot, who are close to az-Zuhri. And amongst those ones, you have Ibn Uyayna, Ibrahim as-Sad, Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, Awzahi, Ibn Abi Dhib, and others. So these are what the more closer, more renowned ones who have narrated a lot, the frequent narrators upon az-Zuhri. So they kind of somewhat mentioned that, they mentioned an Awra, and Amra and Aisha, Zul Nabi alayhi salam, kama fi Sahihain, that narration in Sahihain, where it mentioned that there's no mention regarding iqtisal for each salat, or for combining between the salat. There's no mentioned, as you mentioned, هذا إرق فكانت تغتسل لكل so they mentioned that, but فكانت تغتسل من كل بيت, that was from her act that she made ghusl for each salat. So they mentioned that the narration of Habiba regarding istihada, that no mention of her performing al-ghusl, except for when she completed her cycle, her menstrual cycle. But as for each salat, while praying them, that to combine between both and to make ghusl for Maghrib, for Dhuhr and Asr, Maghrib and Isha and Fajr, there's no mention of this in the narration by Bukhari and Muslim. And I mentioned that this narrator, Suhail, that there's some kalam about him. There's some kalam regarding this particular narrator. I mentioned that he made an error. So of those who accuse that he made an error. So you find Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani that he mentioned regarding this particular narrator where he state, Suduq, Taghayyar, that is one is said to be Suduq, Taghayyar, Hifdhuhu bi-akhir, that he Suduq, but also he kind of somewhat memory was affected later on in his life. So he kind of somewhat his memory was not the same later on in his life. So it changed later on in his life. So they mentioned, Abu Ulama mentioned, that of some see the hadith as like this narrator as being Hassan, but of those who are hadith to be Daif, or of those who hold the hadith to be Daif. So you have that discussion. So you find that, as we mentioned, that of those who have done some editing of this book, of them, Mahir al-Fahl, he mentioned, أخطأ فيه سهيل بن صالح إسنادا ومتنا, that is narrated Suhail, that he made an error both in the isnad and also in the matan, in the chain and the isnad. Amal isnad, then you can somewhat know, as for the isnad, that he placed the hadith on different individuals. At times Asma, at times Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh. So placed in the isnad. And also you find that also matters regarding that most of the top students of Zuhri that did not mention this portion of hadith as a narration of the case of Habiba. Then they mentioned that Falam Yadhkur were also in the matan that no one mentioned regarding this multiple ghusl for the salawat. So al-ghusl repeated, performing ghusl for the different salawat. So they said no one had mentioned this. So he mentioned in one of his books, he discussed this matter further in detail, but you have that discussion regarding this hadith by way of the sanad and the matan. But I mean, as we said, some of the ulama authenticate the hadith, while others hold the hadith, where they said the hadith is Hasan, where others hold the hadith to be Daif. So that's that discussion between the ulama of hadith relating to this particular hadith. As for the next, and they mentioned the hadith of hadith, they mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ kind of somewhat instructed where he said, إِذَا أَدْبَرَتْ فَاغْسِلِي أَنْكِ دَمْ وَصَلِّي. That the Prophet ﷺ, that he instructed that a woman who's experiencing al-istihada, that when her cycle comes to an end, she take a bath and she take a ghusl, then she prays without per se mentioning that she repeats her ghusl for the salawat. So they mentioned regarding concerns and stats of that discussion regarding that particular hadith. So that hadith, there's some discussion regarding this hadith of that has been mentioned. As for what is discussed next regarding what is said in the hadith, or the understanding of the hadith, or what is meant in the hadith, that as for this particular hadith, that with the Prophet ﷺ, they mentioned that لِتَجْلِسْ فِي mirkin. So they mentioned that tajlis, for her to sit in the mirkin, that mirkin is like, as I said, a basin that people used to use to wash. So it was a mirkin is a basin, a tub that the people would wash their clothing in, as the ulama have clarified. And I mentioned that to the Prophet ﷺ, when he instructed her to sit, for her to go inside there with water inside it, and it mentioned that to see if when she's in it, to see if whatever discharge, that if it comes on top and of that color, then safra, then considered to be, that would be considered to be that of al-istihada. And if it's something else, then it is al-hayd. So kind of somewhat to distinguish for her whether it is dam al-istihada or it is dam al-hayd, for her to use of this method to try to see what exactly is happening. So they mentioned that if it comes to the top of the water, floats on top of the water, then it's considered to be hayd al-istihada, or it's considered to be istihada, continuous blood flow. But if it is not, then it is considered to be al-hayd. So it is not intended for her to per se to for her julus fi American, that is not for her to wash in it, but for her kind of somewhat to check to see what exactly is happening with her. Then I mentioned tatawadda, as I mentioned that I mentioned tatawadda. Some narration mentioned tawadda fima bayna dhalik. So what is meant by and perform wudu between these ghusl, what is intended regarding it, that if you perform al-ghusl for Dhuhr and Asr, then she can make wudu for Asr. So she'll perform ghusl, and that ghusl will be intended for to pray Dhuhr and Asr. But if she wished to perform ghusl or wudu in between, then there's no harm. There's no harm, and the same thing with Maghrib and Isha. If she choose after performing ghusl for Maghrib and to pray also Isha, then in between she can make al-wudu. They mention regarding that of the ulama mentioned that of what the instruction and what is mentioned in this hadith, that the woman who is going through this situation regarding istihada, that for her to, when she wished to pray, that for her to make ghusl, pray Dhuhr and Asr together. And some narration mentions that she was ill, that or because of the illness that she was experiencing, so that leniency was giving for her. Where so they mentioned that she can combine between Dhuhr and Asr, perform one ghusl, and that ghusl would be used to pray Dhuhr and Asr. And they mentioned that what is the salat, the combining would be the salat, would be at his Dhuhr, would be pray, as I said, al-jam asuri, would be pray in its last hours, and Asr will be brought forward and pray in its earliest time. So as I said, it's no, so that's the jam that is intended according to what is mentioned by some of the further, al-jam asuri. And the same thing will apply to Maghrib. So pray Maghrib at its last hour, its last minutes, and then Isha will be prayed immediately as it comes in. So each that is prayed at its normal time, but one will pray at its last, at its ending time, and the other at its beginning time. So that's what some of the ulama discuss as to what is intended. So that's concerning this particular hadith that we have mentioned here. So as for what can be taken from the hadith, what can be taken from the hadith regarding ahkam al-fiqhiyya, this particular hadith that they mentioned, discuss a matter that will be discussed further again as other hadith will go into it. But they mentioned that this matter is to discuss the topic of that combining between the salawat and also ghusl for the salat. Performing ghusl for a woman in a state of istihada, is it upon her that she has to pay ghusl, then pray Dhuhr and Asr together? The ulama mentioned regarding concern al-ghusl for the salawat, that the ulama mentioned that it is something which is, of the ulama who take the position, is something which is mustahab. So they mentioned it is something which is mustahab. It is not wajib, according to some of the ulama, but it is mustahab, not wajib, but there is a khilaf between the ulama. So there is a khilaf between the ulama. Jumhur of the ulama, include the A'immatul Arba, take the position that what is mentioned inside this hadith, it is not meant by way of wujub, not compulsory, to be done of for Dhuhr Asr, perform one ghusl, for Maghrib and Isha, another ghusl, and for Fajr, a separate ghusl. They say this act or this system, it is regarding the salat and ghusl for a woman that experiences istihada, it is not wajib, but something which is preferred to be done. It is, but it is not to the extent of wajib. That's the view taken by Jumhur al-Ulama, including A'immat al-Arba, that Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, and Ahmad al-Hanbal, alayhim rahmatullahi ta'ala jami'an. But as we will discuss for that later, that also you'll find other aqwal on this topic. You have other aqwal on this topic, but as we mentioned that Jumhur take the position it is not wajib. Also what they take from the hadith, that after performing that that they mentioned that also that the woman that from the hadith, it shows regarding that the Prophet ﷺ that istihada, that she was allowed in this in the hadith, that al-jam bayna salat, that she was allowed to combine between the salat, and that's the case of a mustahada. So a case of a woman who's going through istihada, that from the hadith it indicates that it is allowed a permissibility for them to combine between the salat. As I mentioned, that istihada is considered to be like a form of marad. So it can be a marad and can be intense for some. So based upon this, that in the time of that they are facing difficulties of their blood discharge, of loss of blood, then at times that they can combine between their salat. That they can combine between their salat. So that's concerning. So they mentioned that this is of something which is for those who are find it very difficult in their istihada, that their continuous blood discharge, that at times that they can combine between their salat. And even though mentioned that to be discussed further regarding the matter regarding performing ghusl before the salat. So those are the main ahkam that are discussed regarding this particular hadith. So the hadith it discussed, we said the hadith here, there's the khilaf between the ulama on the authenticity of the hadith. Of the ulama, all hadith to be hasan, and of the ulama, all hadith to be daif, due to the fact that we mentioned that one of the narrator, Suhail ibn Abi Saleh, that there's some kalam about him. So there's some discussion between the ulama regarding this particular narrator, regarding that he have made errors in the matan and also errors in the sanad, both in the chain and in the text of the hadith. So based upon this, you have that discussion where you find that there's things mentioned in the hadith, that hadith which is similar of the other student of Az-Zuhri did not mention that he mentioned. So most did not mention regarding the matter of the ghusl, but he mentioned this. So this ziyada of this narrator we consider to be suduq, that is it to be accepted or not to be accepted. So these are the things that are mentioned. I will mention the ahkam related to salat, regarding the ghusl being performed, multiple ghusl being performed for the salawat, and also combining between the salawat for a lady that is going through istihada and finding it difficult. So those are the main ahkam of this particular hadith. So with that, inshallah ta'ala, that and the Prophet ﷺ also indicate to her regarding, assist him regarding how to make a distinction regarding al-hayz wa al-istihada by the use of so with that, inshallah ta'ala, that will come to an end regarding this particular hadith, and we'll cover the next hadith in the next session, as the hadith of that comes after, hadith of Hamna. Hamna is much a lengthy hadith, so we'll discuss that hadith in the next session by itself, and also the ahkam that is discussed with it. With that, inshallah ta'ala, will end for today. Wa billahi ta'ala tawfiq wa hadi ila sabil wal akhirah walhamdulillah. About half an hour.